Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Dr. Peter Francia, director of the ECU Center for Survey Research. Dr. Francia, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be on.
ECU just released a poll hot off the press yesterday from North Carolina, and it shows former President Donald Trump with a 1-point lead against Vice President Kamala Harris. What are some of your takeaways?
Oh, I think one of the big takeaways is that when Joe Biden was in the race, when we last polled in June and Biden was still the nominee, the election in North Carolina in 2024 was starting to look to me a lot like the election in 2016. And in North Carolina in 2016, Donald Trump won the state by about 4 percentage points. And we had a governor's race that was about as close as you could get. In that June poll, we had Josh Stein ahead of Mark Robinson by only 1 point. And we had Trump ahead by 5 over Biden in that June poll. So the numbers were really lining up with what the actual results were in North Carolina in 2016. Of course, since June, major changes have happened. Kamala Harris is now the nominee. And with our new numbers, we have Donald Trump up by a point, which is roughly what he beat Joe Biden by in North Carolina in 2020. We had Roy Cooper, the Democratic governor, win by about 5 percentage points, and we showed Josh Stein up 6 percentage points in our current poll that we just completed. So that tells us that we're looking, now it looks like we're more in an election in North Carolina that looks like 2020 versus the one that we had in 2016, at least based on the two polls that we did, the one in June versus the one that we just completed.
So that's a little bit of a shift there. And this poll was taken last week. As we know, the DNC was 2 weeks ago. Did you notice, or I'm assuming there was not a DNC convention bump for Kamala Harris since she's still down?
Well, I think her bump came right after the announcement that she was the nominee. We started to see that shift and pretty quickly. So I don't think there was a whole lot more room for her to grow beyond that initial bump, because a lot of polls showed within just a week or two of the change from Biden over to Harris that the numbers were moving in Harris's direction. So I think that explains why there wasn't any major bounce for Harris coming out of the convention. I think she already got a bounce of sorts right before that.
You mentioned that these races are mirroring 2020 opposed to 2016. We're seeing Harris down by 1, but in the election for governor, the Democrat Josh Stein is up by 6 points to his Republican challenger. Why are you seeing the ticket splitting here?
Well, we've had a history of that in North Carolina. I don't want to bore you with too much history, but if you went back 20 years ago to the 2004 election, and I know that is a long time ago, but if you look at what happened in North Carolina, George Bush won the state by double digits, the Republican, over John Kerry, and Mike Easley, the Democrat, won by double digits in the race for governor, and Mike Easley is a Democrat. So if you go back 20 years, there's gigantic ticket splitting happening in North Carolina. You don't have to go back to the 1960s or 70s. You can look, in this century, in 2004, there was a whole lot of that going on. Now that it's not as extreme as it used to be 20 years ago, it's come down. But the ticket split that we're seeing in the poll right now, is fairly consistent with other ticket splits, including in 2020, where again Roy Cooper won by 4 to 5 points, and as the Democrat, and Donald Trump won by 1 point. So, what we're seeing in the polls right now pretty closely mirrors that type of ticket splitting.
Can you talk to us about the demographics here? Because as you noted, Donald Trump is only up by 1 point in North Carolina right now. So it's really anyone's race. But as you break the numbers down by demographic, it paints a very interesting picture. So give us the details.
Yeah, on the demographics, I mean, no huge surprises that Donald Trump does very, very well among white voters, winning by about a 2-to-1 margin. And that's consistent if you look at his exit poll totals in 2016 in North Carolina, as well as in 2020 in the race against Joe Biden. So I don't think that's a huge surprise. I think what is interesting is that if you look at Mark Robinson's numbers among white voters in North Carolina in our poll, he's not doing nearly as well as Donald Trump. He's lagging behind where Trump is right now, and that partially explains some of the differences that we're finding in the two poll numbers, with Trump, of course, doing better than Robinson when comparing those two races.
This summer obviously was huge for this race. Joe Biden did drop out, but both candidate Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris picked their running mate. Trump picked Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, and Vice President Kamala Harris picked Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. What do North Carolina voters feel about these? How do they feel about these two? And is this changing anyone's mind and heart in this race?
No, what we looked at the people who had said they're already voting for Trump, and then asked that question about J.D. Vance, and there were not Republicans who were unhappy with J.D. Vance. Nobody said that. I mean, it was around 1%, very small percentage said that they were less likely to vote for Trump. And so there was some enthusiasm for Vance. I mean, his numbers were on the more likely to vote for Trump. Vance did well, but when comparing it to Tim Walz, there was a higher percentage of Democrats who said that they were more likely to vote for Harris based on the Walz pick than there were Trump voters who said they were more likely to vote for Trump based on the J.D. Vance selection. And some of that could simply be a function of the fact that Republicans are sort of dug in on Trump. They know who Trump is, and regardless of who he picked, they were going to vote for him. So it may not reflect any sort of discontent at all with Vance. It may simply be Republicans were, they knew they were going to vote for Trump because he's been in the public eye for so long. Harris, by comparison, is relatively new. A lot of Democrats are being reintroduced to her. The fact that Walz jumped in, I think it was an important pick for Harris based on that because she's less well known. But she seems to have, succeeded in what she needed to accomplish in picking a running mate that does excite Democrats.
I've been lucky. I've been able to talk to voters throughout the country for the past over a year now, and everyone has come to the consensus top issue facing voters is the economy. Is that what you're seeing in North Carolina, A? And how has that changed from the last time you've done this poll earlier this summer?
Yeah, overwhelming. We've been, the economy dominates. We've been asking that question in several polls. If you go back to our June poll, inflation was the top issue among many issues that we listed at 42%. Now that's come down to 30% in our latest poll. But the economy in general, which is another economic issue outside that we separated from inflation, that went up a bit from our June poll. And if you combine in the current poll inflation plus the economy in general, it is a majority. So what was it? James Carville famously said in 1992, "It's the economy, stupid." This election still indicates that economic issues are still dominant here in 2024.
And this poll really shows that 2 months out from Election Day, North Carolina is a toss-up state. Is North Carolina a must-win, in your opinion, for either Trump or Harris?
It's a must-win for Donald Trump. I think it's very hard to imagine a path to victory for the Trump campaign if they were to lose North Carolina. And part of the reason for that is you'd have to think that if the Harris Walz ticket does well in North Carolina, then that probably means that they do well in Georgia as well, which is, of course, a neighboring state. And, if the South, those two southern states were to move into the Democratic column, then Donald Trump's path becomes very, very complicated. Then he, it's a very difficult path to victory. You would think that if southern states are going into the Democratic column, that some of those Midwest states then, which tend to be a little more Democratic, that they would then be also going for Harris. And if that's the case, then he can't win. So I think North Carolina sort of tells us, gives us some insight potentially into where some of these other battleground states might go. And if that's the case, then it certainly starts for Donald Trump with a win in North Carolina. And then he hopes that if he's won in North Carolina, that he can pull off victories in Georgia. And then, of course, those key three states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, because that's really where the path to victory lies. I think for Harris, North Carolina is gravy. If she wins it, then she's probably running up the electoral college score. If she loses it, there's other paths to victory for her. I think the Harris campaign should certainly invest in North Carolina. It's close enough to do that. But in terms of it being the most important state for her to win, North Carolina certainly is not at the top of the list. I would peg, again, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin as higher priorities for the Harris campaign than North Carolina.
This poll shows Trump only up by 1%. Within the margin of error here, only a few percent are undecided. So do you think North Carolina is really going to come out to turnout on November?
Oh, I think absolutely. Turnout's been high in the last several presidential election cycles. You could go all the way back to the 2000 election, where, of course, the Bush-Gore election came down to just those few votes in Florida. And we've really seen an uptick since that time, where more Americans are voting, at least as a percentage of the electorate and in raw numbers. And so, turnout's been up over the past several presidential election cycles. And given how competitive it is in North Carolina, and there's a large body of research that political scientists have put together that shows competitive elections predictably increase turnout. So in an election that not just our poll, but many other polls are also showing to be a toss-up, I would expect that turnout will be very high in North Carolina in 2024.
We are sitting 2 months almost to the day from Election Day. So what specifically are you looking out between now and then?
I think that it's important to follow the narratives of the campaign. I think when Joe Biden was the candidate for the Democrats, the Republicans were crafting a broader narrative of strong versus weak. And that started even before the Biden debate performance. That sort of language was being dropped into a lot of messages. But after the debate performance, it seemed to really reinforce that narrative. Biden struggled, of course, in that debate, but even his voice, it was often sometimes hard to hear him, and his voice even sounded weak. Trump, of course, after the debate, the assassination attempt, his fist in the air, blood coming from his ear, it epitomized strong in that image. So this strong versus weak narrative was where I think the election was going with Biden as the candidate. I think that's been complicated now with Kamala Harris. Harris has come out sort of touting her accomplishments as a prosecutor. And I think that's no accident. I don't think that's a coincidence. She's deliberately picking that so that she can look like she's a strong candidate to counter that narrative. I think now to answer your question, where are we going? I think we have to see where that broader narrative now takes us. Does the narrative sort of continue on the Republican side of trying to push strong versus weak, or will the Trump campaign pivot and try something else? I think on the Harris side, the broader narrative there is stable versus unstable, and I think you'll see messages that sort of play to that broader narrative. So keep an eye on broader narratives as we head into the home stretch. I think that it will be interesting to see where the campaigns go in this home stretch.
That's a really interesting point. And as those narratives continue to take form, I hope you come back on, break down new polls with me. Dr. Francia, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to talk with you.